The dust of Redemption Gulch settled on Ilara's shame like a shroud. It clung to the thin, coarse fabric of the shift they'd given her, a garment that did little to ward off the chill of the high desert wind or the heat of 100 hungry stares. She stood on a crude wooden platform, the same one used for auctioning livestock, her hands bound loosely before her. Below, a sea of weathered faces swam in the merciless afternoon sun, leering, pitying, indifferent. Jasper Thorne stood at the forefront, a portly man whose wealth was announced by the gold chain straining across his waistcoat and the possessive glint in his eyes. He saw her not as a person but as a prize, a tarnished piece of property to be won and polished for his own use. His bids were loud, bullying, each one punctuated by a wet smack of his lips that made Ilara's stomach clench. The auctioneer, a scrawny man with a reedy voice, chanted the rising price, his words a death knell for what little hope she had left. She had answered an advertisement for a mail-order bride, a desperate gamble to escape a past that had already destroyed her. She had not expected this. This was not a marriage proposal, it was a slave market. As Thorne's final, triumphant bid of $500 echoed in the sudden quiet, a tear she had refused to shed finally tracked a clean path through the grime on her cheek. Then, a voice, quiet but firm, cut through the silence. "I bid the deed to Haven's End." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Head swiveled toward the back, where a man stood alone, almost lost in the shadows of the blacksmith's forge. He was tall and lean, his features obscured by a low-brimmed hat, his clothes worn but clean. Ilara had never seen him before. He stepped forward, and the crowd parted for him as if he were a phantom. In his hand, he held a folded piece of paper. The deed. The sum was astronomical, an act of such profound and reckless sacrifice that it beggared belief. Jasper Thorne's face purpled with rage, but he could not match it. The rancher, Silas, met the auctioneer's stunned gaze and simply nodded. The transaction was made in a daze of murmured disbelief. He mounted the steps, untied her hands with a touch that was surprisingly gentle, and wrapped his own dusty coat around her trembling shoulders. He said nothing, his eyes, a startling, clear grey, betraying no emotion at all. He had saved her, but in doing so, he had ruined himself. Ilara looked at this stranger, this timid ghost who had just sacrificed his entire world for her, and a single, terrifying question screamed in the silence of her mind: why? The ride to Haven's End was a long, silent passage through a world that seemed to hold its breath. Ilara sat beside him on the wagon bench, the heavy coat a cocoon of bewildering safety. She watched him from the corner of her eye, studying the hard line of his jaw, the way his hands held the reins with a steady, practiced competence. He never spoke, never looked at her, his gaze fixed on the rugged trail ahead. Her fear, a cold, unfamiliar companion, warred with a fragile seedling of curiosity. She had been bought, but this did not feel like ownership. There was no triumph in his posture, only a profound weariness. The valley, when they finally reached it, was a shock of gentle green carved into the harsh, red rock landscape. A small, sturdy ranch house sat nestled beside a whispering creek, shaded by ancient cottonwoods. It was a place of peace, a sanctuary. He led her inside a house filled with the ghosts of a life lived before. It was sparse but meticulously clean. He gestured toward a small room off the main living space. "This will be yours," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. "No one will bother you here. You are safe." And then he was gone, retreating into the barn, leaving her to the echoing silence. She explored her small room, touching the hand-stitched quilt on the narrow bed, the smooth, worn wood of the dresser. Through the single window, she could see a small, fenced-off plot of land under the largest cottonwood. Two small, weathered headstones stood there, their inscriptions long since erased by wind and rain. A sudden, sharp understanding pierced her confusion. This was not just a ranch, it was a mausoleum of memory. This man hadn't just lost his land, he had sacrificed the last remnant of a life that had already been taken from him. Days bled into a quiet routine. He would leave a plate of food on the table for her before heading out at dawn and would not return until dusk, his face etched with the exhaustion of a man working land that was no longer his. He asked nothing of her, made no demands. In this quiet, unassuming decency, a fragile tendril of trust began to take root in the barren soil of her heart. The rhythm of their strange, shared solitude began to feel almost normal. Ilara found a purpose in small domestic acts, tending the small vegetable garden behind the house, mending Silas's worn shirts, ensuring a hot meal was waiting for him when he returned from his labor. These were not commands from a master but choices she made, small stones laid to build a bridge across the chasm of silence between them. He would acknowledge her efforts with a slight, almost imperceptible nod, but in his eyes she saw a flicker of something she dared not name. It looked like gratitude. It felt like relief. One evening, as twilight bled purple and orange across the valley rim, the peace was shattered. The sound of hoofbeats and crude, drunken laughter echoed from the trail. Ilara's blood ran cold. It was Jasper Thorn, flanked by a half-dozen of his sycophants. They reined their horses in just beyond the creek, a pack of wolves circling a fold. "Silas!" Thorn's voice boomed, thick with malice. "Send out my property. Send out that damaged piece of Boston trash you're hiding in there." Silas appeared on the porch, his body a rigid silhouette against the lamplight spilling from the doorway. He held an old rifle, but his hands were steady. "She's not your property, Thorn." Ride on's a sneer twisted Thorn's face. "You've got nothing left, you fool. You're a hired hand on your own land. You can't protect her." As if to prove his point, one of his men lit a torch and tossed it into the dry hay barn 50 yards from the house. Flames erupted with a hungry roar, painting the night sky in hellish shades of red. Panic seized Ilara, but Silas's voice cut through it, sharp and commanding. "Buckets! By the well!" What followed was a desperate, frantic ballet. There was no time for fear, no space for the old hesitations. He worked the pump, his muscles straining, and she hauled the heavy, sloshing buckets, her breath coming in ragged sobs. The heat was a living thing, scorching their faces, and the smoke clawed at their lungs. They worked as one, a seamless unit forged in the heart of the blaze, their separate fears melting away into a single, shared purpose, to save this place. They fought until the flames subsided, leaving the barn a smoldering, skeletal ruin. They stood in the aftermath, covered in soot and ash, chests heaving, their gazes meeting across the scorched earth. The physical threat had passed, for now, but in the glowing embers, a new, unspoken bond had been forged. The charred skeleton of the barn stood as a constant, grim reminder of Thorn's malice. The physical attack had failed, but it was only a prelude. Thorn was a man who fought not with honor but with poison, and his next assault came not with fire, but with ink and lies. News arrived with the supply wagon that the circuit judge, a man named Patterson who was widely known to be in Thorn's pocket, was due in Redemption Gulch. The timing was no coincidence. Within a day, the town was buzzing. Thorn had filed a formal complaint. He wasn't just claiming breach of a verbal contract at a public auction, he was accusing Ilara of being a wanted fugitive. The proof, they said, was undeniable. Doc Hemlock, a kind, aging physician who had attended to Silas's family years ago, rode out to Haven's End himself, his face grave. He carried a piece of paper as if it were contaminated. It was a wanted poster, crudely printed but chillingly effective. It showed a caricature of Ilara's face, her features twisted into a sneer. The text below accused a Helena Vance of larceny, flight from justice, and acts of gross moral turpitude in the city of Boston. A reward was offered for her capture. Ilara stared at it, the world tilting on its axis. It was her story, her life, but warped through a funhouse mirror of cruelty and deceit. The name was hers, the city was right, but the crime was a grotesque inversion of the truth. She had been the victim, not the perpetrator. This poster was the final nail in the coffin of her old life, a lie so potent it had crossed a continent to haunt her. The law, which should have been her shield, was now Thorn's sharpest sword. Silas took the poster from her trembling hands, his own expression hardening into granite. "It's a lie," she whispered, the words barely audible. All of it he didn't need her to say it. He folded the paper with slow, deliberate precision. "I know," he said, his voice a low rumble. But they both understood the terrifying truth. In Judge Patterson's court, the truth wouldn't matter. Thorn had found a way to take her, and this time, the prize wouldn't be a life of servitude, but the cold finality of a prison cell. That night, the sky turned a bruised, angry grey. The wind began to howl, a mournful cry that swept down from the high peaks and funneled through the valley. A blizzard, sudden and violent, descended upon them, burying the world in a blinding tempest of white. The trail to Redemption Gulch vanished. The world shrank to the four walls of the small ranch house. They were trapped, besieged not by Thorne's men, but by the raw, untamable power of nature itself. The storm raged for 2 days, a relentless assault of snow and wind that rattled the windows and shook the very foundations of the house. The enforced proximity was an agony of unspoken tension. There was nowhere to retreat, no work to distract them, only the roaring of the wind and the deafening silence between them. On the second night, huddled by the meager warmth of the stone hearth, the dam of Ilara's composure finally broke. A single sob escaped her, then another, and soon she was weeping, the great, shuddering gasps of a soul that could bear its burden no longer. Silas, who had been staring into the flames, turned to her. His usual stoicism was gone, replaced by a raw, aching concern. He moved to sit beside her on the hearth, not touching her, but his presence was a tangible comfort. Through her tears, the story poured out of her, a torrent of shame and pain held back for years. She spoke of her life as a governess in Boston, of the trust she had placed in the wealthy Albright family. She recounted the night Mr. Albright's son-in-law, a man of influence and depravity, had cornered her, and how she had fought him off. She described the shamefaced fury of his wife, Mrs. Albright, who, to protect her family's name and her husband's reputation, had accused Ilara of stealing a string of pearls and driven her from the house with threats and accusations. The wanted poster was her final, vicious act of revenge. When she finished, the only sound was the howling of the wind. She waited for his judgment, for the disgust. Instead, Silas finally spoke, his voice low and heavy with a grief that mirrored her own. "My wife, Sarah, and our little boy, they died in a storm like this. I was miles away, trying to fetch the doctor. By the time I got back, it was too late." He looked at the window, at the swirling chaos outside. "I know what it is to be helpless against something you can't fight." He turned back to her, and for the first time, she saw the depths of his own loss in his clear grey eyes. He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers closing around hers. It wasn't a gesture of pity, but of profound, shared understanding. "We will face him," he said, his voice imbued with a newfound strength. "Together." The blizzard broke as suddenly as it had arrived, leaving the world pristine and silent under a blanket of white. The cold, clean air felt like a new beginning, but the truce with the world was short-lived. By midday, a dark line of riders appeared against the snow, their forms stark and menacing. It was Thorne, and with him rode the portly, black-clad figure of Judge Patterson and a dozen deputized townsmen, their faces grim. They stopped where the creek was frozen solid, a grim parody of the night of the fire. "Silas," the judge called out, his voice thin and sharp in the cold air. "You are harboring a fugitive of the law. Bring Eleanor Vance out now, or we will take her by force and charge you with obstruction." The moment had come. Ilara felt the familiar icy grip of fear, but then she felt Silas's presence beside her as he stepped onto the porch. She took a deep breath, remembering his promise, and walked out to stand with him. She would not hide. Thorne's face was a mask of smug triumph. He held up the wanted poster, brandishing it like a trophy. "It's over, girl. The law has caught up with you." He looked past her to Silas. "And you sentimental fool. You lost your ranch and now you'll lose your freedom for this worthless creature." But the woman who stood on the porch was not the same one who had trembled on the auction block. The fire and the storm had burned away her passivity, reforging it into a quiet, unyielding strength. She met the judge's cold eyes, her chin held high. She would not be a passive victim in the final act of her own tragedy. Silas stood beside her, his hand resting almost imperceptibly on the small of her back, a silent, unmovable wall of support. His faith in her was a shield, and she would not let him down. "That poster is a lie," Ilara said, her voice ringing out with a clarity that surprised even herself. It carried across the snow, silencing the murmurs of the posse. My name is Ilara Vance, not Eleanor. A small detail, perhaps, but lies are often built on such careless foundations, Judge Patterson scoffed. A desperate denial. Do you have proof? The burden of proof lies with the accuser, Ilara countered, her mind sharp and focused. She looked directly at Thorne, whose smirk had begun to falter. Mr. Thorne, how did you come by this poster? It's from Boston, a city thousands of miles away. Did it simply fall into your lap? Thorne blustered, I have correspondence. Business associates indeed, Ilara pressed on, her voice like ice. And did these associates happen to be the very people who accused me? Did you, Mr. Thorne, write to Mrs. Albright, offering to handle the problem of the runaway governess in exchange for a portion of the supposed reward? Did you conspire with her to ensure this lie followed me here? A wave of uncertainty rippled through the posse. Her questions were too specific, too pointed. She wasn't making a vague denial, she was constructing a case. She turned her attention back to the posse, her gaze sweeping over their faces. I was a governess. I was assaulted by my employer's husband. When I fought him off, his wife, to save their family from scandal, accused me of theft to discredit me. She threw me out with nothing. That is my crime. Not theft, but survival. Not immorality, but the refusal to be a silent victim. Her words, raw with the simple, unadorned truth, hung in the cold air. They carried the weight of authenticity, a stark contrast to Thorne's blustering greed. Enraged at losing control of the narrative, Thorne lunged forward, his face a contorted mask of fury. You lying witch! I'll silence you myself. Before Thorne's hand could touch her, Silas moved. It was not the movement of a timid man, but the fluid, deadly grace of a protector roused to righteous fury. He intercepted Thorne with a force that sent the larger man stumbling back. Thorne swung a wild fist, and Silas met it, turning the blow aside and driving his own fist into Thorne's gut. The fight was brutal and blessedly short. Silas, fueled by years of repressed grief and a fierce, newfound purpose, fought with a cold, contained violence that was terrifying to behold. He systematically dismantled Thorne, ending the confrontation by shoving him face down into a snowbank, where he lay sputtering and defeated. That's enough! Judge Patterson shrieked, his composure shattered. Seize him! Seize that man for assaulting an officer of my court's business. Several men in the posse reluctantly raised their rifles, their expressions conflicted. They were at a deadlocked, impossible standoff. Silas stood over Thorne, breathing heavily, prepared to face the consequences. At that exact moment, another sound broke the tension, the jingle of a harness and the creak of wagon wheels. A wagon crested the snow-covered rise, driven at a reckless pace by Doc Hemlock. The old doctor stood as he drove, whipping the reins. Hold your fire, he yelled, his voice carrying surprising authority. Patterson, you pompous fraud! You're party to a conspiracy! He pulled the wagon to a halt, and all eyes turned to the passenger who was calmly stepping down from the seat beside him. The sight of the man made Ilara gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. It was a face from her nightmares, a face from her past, but one she never, ever expected to see in this wild, forsaken place. The man was elderly and impeccably dressed despite the trail-worn state of his traveling coat. He leaned heavily on a silver-headed cane, his face a portrait of weary dignity. It was Mr. Albright, the patriarch of the Boston family, the father of the very woman who had framed her. He was the architect of her original downfall, and his presence here felt like a final, cruel twist of the knife. He ignored the stunned assembly, his tired eyes scanning the scene until they found Ilara. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, his gaze filled with a profound and sorrowful regret. Miss Vance, he said, his voice raspy but clear. I have spent 6 months searching for you. He turned to Judge Patterson and the baffled posse, his voice taking on a tone of command. My daughter, Mary, passed from this world 2 months ago. But before she did, God granted her a moment of clarity. She confessed everything. She confessed her husband's crime, and her own part in framing this innocent young woman to conceal it from a leather satchel. Mr. Albright produced a sheaf of documents. This, he announced, holding up a paper with a governor's seal, is a full and unconditional letter of pardon for Ilara Vance, retracting the unjust warrant for her arrest. And this, he added, brandishing a second document, is a sworn affidavit detailing my late daughter's confession and exposing the fraudulent communications between her and Mr. Jasper Thorne. The air went out of Thorne's blustering rage. Judge Patterson's face went pale. The posse lowered their rifles, their expression shifting from suspicion to contempt for the men who had deceived them. The legal threat, the foundation of Thorne's power, had not just cracked, it had been utterly demolished, swept away by a truth delivered from beyond the grave. Her name was cleared. The shame that had clung to her for so long finally dissolved into the clean, cold air. She was free. With Thorne and Judge Patterson now facing the very legal system they had sought to corrupt, the posse quietly dispersed, their shame palpable. Mr. Albright approached Ilara, his expression etched with a deep, personal sorrow. "Miss Vance," he began, "no apology can suffice. My daughter not only stole your name but also a significant inheritance left to you by your parents, which I was executor of. The funds have been recovered. They are yours." He gestured back toward the trail. "I have arranged passage. I can take you home, back to Boston, to a life of comfort and security. It is the very least I can do." Ilara looked at the old man, a ghost from a life that no longer felt like her own. Then her eyes drifted to the small, snow-dusted ranch house, the structure that had become her unlikely sanctuary. She looked at the two small headstones under the cottonwood, markers of a sorrow she now understood. Finally, her gaze rested on Silas, who stood watching her, his face unreadable but his grey eyes full of a silent, desperate question. She had a choice. She could return to the world that had discarded her, or she could stay in the one that had saved her. She gave Mr. Albright a small, grateful smile. "Thank you, sir. But I believe I am already home." The first thing they did with the restored funds was ride to Redemption Gulch and buy back the deed to Haven's End. That evening, standing on the porch of the home that was now truly theirs, Silas turned to her. The timid, haunted man was gone, replaced by someone whose spirit had been rekindled by the fight to protect her. He took both of her hands in his. "Ilara," he said, her name a quiet vow on his lips. "I have nothing to offer you but a damaged heart and a valley full of quiet days." He looked into her eyes, and she saw not a question, but a certainty. "Marry me." A tear, this one of pure, unadulterated joy, traced a path down her cheek. "Yes," she whispered, the word a promise for all the sunrises to come. They stood together, his arm around her, and looked out over the peaceful valley, their valley. Haven's End was no longer an ending, but a beginning.